The summer heat pressed down upon Sparta like a hand from the gods themselves. King Leonidas stood alone on the stone terrace of his palace, watching the sun bleed crimson over the Taygetus mountains. He was 50 years old, his beard streaked with gray, his body carved from decades of war. But tonight, he felt every one of those years in his bones. The messenger had arrived 3 days ago. Xerxes, king of kings, lord of Persia, had crossed the Hellespont with an army so vast it drank rivers dry. 200,000 soldiers, perhaps more. They marched toward Greece like a tide of iron and flesh, and nothing, not prayers, not walls, not the combined armies of every Greek city, seemed capable of stopping them. The Ephors had refused him a full army. The Carnea festival was sacred, they said. Sparta could not march to war during holy days. Leonidas had argued until his voice broke, but the old priests would not bend. Religious law bound even kings, so he had made his choice. 300 men, not an army, a statement. He would take his royal guard, the Hippeis, the finest warriors Sparta had ever produced. Every one of them a father, every one of them with a living son to carry their name forward. This was not a battle they were marching toward. It was a sacrifice. Before we begin this journey into one of ancient Greece's darkest and most unspeakable stories, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if this is your first time on our channel, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is a story that official history tried to bury, but memory refused to forget. The door behind him creaked open. He did not turn. He knew her footsteps better than his own heartbeat. Gorgo crossed the terrace silently, her sandals whispering against the stone. She stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a long moment, neither spoke. They had been married for over 20 years. She had given him a son, Pleistarchus, now 15 and burning to join his father. She had given him counsel that rivaled any general's. She had given him a reason to live, and now he was giving her a reason to grieve. "The men are ready," she said. Her voice did not waver. It never did. "They feast with their families tonight. Tomorrow they march." Leonidas nodded slowly. "And their wives?" "Their wives are Spartan." A pause. "They understand." He finally turned to look at her. Gorgo's face was composed, imperial, revealing nothing. But her eyes, those dark, fierce eyes that had captivated him since girlhood, glistened in the dying light. "I will not return," he said quietly. It was not a question. It was not a plea for comfort. It was simply the truth, spoken aloud for the first and last time. Gorgo held his gaze. "Then return with your shield," she whispered, "or upon it." The ancient words, the Spartan farewell that mothers spoke to sons, that wives spoke to husbands. Come back victorious or come back dead. There was no third option. There never had been. Leonidas reached out and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. "Raise our son to be worthy of his name. He already is." Her voice finally cracked, just slightly, just enough. "He already is, my king." They stood together as the last light faded from the sky. Two figures carved from the same unyielding stone that had built Sparta itself. Tomorrow, the march would begin. Tomorrow, 300 men would walk toward the gates of the underworld. But tonight, there was still this, still her warmth beside him, still the distant sound of laughter from the barracks, where his men treasured their final hours with the people they loved. Tonight, Leonidas allowed himself to be not a king, not a warrior, but simply a man saying goodbye. Dawn broke over Sparta with merciless clarity. The sky stretched pale and endless, not a single cloud to offer shade for the journey ahead. At the city's edge, 300 men stood in perfect formation, their crimson cloaks vivid against the dusty earth, their bronze shields gleaming like captured sunlight. The women of Sparta lined the road in silence, no wailing, no tears shed publicly. That was not the Spartan way. But their presence spoke volumes. Mothers whose sons they would never hold again, wives whose beds would grow cold, daughters who would grow old telling stories of this day. Leonidas walked the line of his men, studying their faces. He knew every one of them. Dienekes, the veteran of countless campaigns, who stood barely 5.5 feet tall but fought like a man twice his size. Alpheus and Maron, twin brothers who had never been separated in battle. Aristodemos, whose sharp tongue and sharper sword made him invaluable. These were not merely soldiers, they were brothers, bound by blood spilled together on foreign soil. "You know why you were chosen," Leonidas said, his voice carrying across the silent assembly. "Not for your strength alone, not for your skill. You were chosen because you have sons, because your names will continue, because Sparta will remember what we do in the days to come." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The Persians believe they come to conquer Greece. They are wrong. They come to learn what free men are capable of when defending their homeland. We will teach them. We will teach them so thoroughly that 1,000 years from now, men will still speak of the lesson." A ripple passed through the ranks, not of fear, but of grim satisfaction. These men had trained since childhood for exactly this moment. They had been whipped, starved, frozen, and brutalized until pain became meaningless, and fear became a distant memory. They were not marching to die. They were marching to become immortal. The column began to move. They traveled north along the ancient roads, their pace steady and relentless. Other Greeks joined them along the way. Thespians, Thebans, soldiers from smaller cities who understood what was at stake. By the time they reached the narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae, their numbers had swelled to nearly 7,000. But it was the 300 who drew every eye. The crimson cloaks, the lambda shields, the cold, certain faces of men who had already made peace with death. Thermopylae, the hot gates. A strip of land barely wide enough for 2 wagons to pass abreast, hemmed between the cliffs and the sea. Here, numbers meant nothing. Here, discipline and courage could hold back the ocean itself. Leonidas surveyed the terrain with a general's practiced eye. The ancient wall built by the Phocians still stood, crumbling in places but defensible. Hot springs bubbled up from the earth nearby, filling the air with the smell of sulfur. Behind them, the pass twisted through the mountains toward Greece. Before them, the coastal plain stretched toward the approaching storm. "They will come from the north," Leonidas said to his captains. "The pass will funnel them. Their cavalry is useless here. Their archers have limited angles. If we hold the wall, we can break wave after wave against the rocks." Dieneces squinted toward the horizon. "How many waves, my king?" "As many as it takes." That night, they rebuilt the wall. 300 Spartans worked alongside thousands of allies, heaving stones into place, reinforcing weak points, preparing the killing ground. Scouts reported that the Persian vanguard was less than 2 days away. Xerxes himself traveled with the army, carried in a golden throne, surrounded by his elite immortals. Around the campfires, the men ate their simple meals and checked their weapons. Some spoke of home, others sat in silence, their thoughts their own. But there was no despair among them, no second guessing. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. Leonidas found Dieneces sitting apart from the others, sharpening his sword with methodical strokes. "You're quiet tonight, old friend." Dieneces looked up, his weathered face creasing into a half-smile. "Just thinking about what the scout said, that when the Persians fire their arrows, they'll be so numerous they'll block out the sun. Does that frighten you?" The old warrior's smile widened. "Frighten me? My king, that's the best news I've heard all day. If they block out the sun, we'll fight in the shade." Leonidas laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to lift the weight pressing down on all of them, if only for a moment. The shade was coming, but first there would be blood. The Persian army arrived like a living thing, a serpentine mass of humanity that seemed to have no end. For 3 days, Leonidas and his men watched from the heights as Xerxes' forces poured onto the coastal plain, their ranks stretching beyond the horizon. The tramping of feet created a constant thunder. The dust they raised dimmed the sun. 200,000, perhaps more. Cavalry from every corner of the empire. Infantry from a dozen conquered nations. And at the heart of it all, the immortals. 10,000 elite warriors whose numbers never diminished. For every fallen soldier was immediately replaced. They wore golden armor and carried wicker shields, their faces hidden behind ornate masks. On the 4th day, a lone rider approached the Greek lines under a flag of parley. He was Persian, dressed in fine silks, his beard perfumed and oiled. He carried himself with the casual arrogance of a man who had never known defeat. "I come with a message from Xerxes, king of kings, lord of all the lands from sunrise to sunset," the messenger announced. "The great king offers you mercy. Lay down your weapons and surrender, and you shall be spared. You will be given lands more fertile than these stony mountains. You will serve a master worthy of your skills." Leonidas stepped forward, flanked by Dieneces and 2 other captains. He studied the messenger with something that might have been amusement. "Your king offers us lands," he said slowly. "Tell me, did he offer the same to the Ionian Greeks before he enslaved them? To the Egyptians? To the Babylonians?" The messenger's smile tightened. The great king's generosity is a collar disguised as a gift." Leonidas's voice hardened. "We are not Ionians. We are not Egyptians. We are Spartans. And Spartans do not kneel. You are fools then. The King of Kings commands an army beyond counting. When his archers loose their arrows, they will blot out the very sun. You cannot possibly—" "Then we will fight in the shade," Dienekes interrupted, his tone almost cheerful. The messenger's composure finally cracked. "You court annihilation. Xerxes will learn." Leonidas stepped closer, his presence suddenly radiating the lethal calm of a man who had killed more enemies than the messenger had ever seen. "Go back to your master. Tell him that the Spartans invite him to come and take our weapons himself. Tell him, Labe, come and take them." The messenger wheeled his horse and fled back toward the Persian lines. Leonidas watched him go, then turned to his men. Word had already spread. 300 Spartans and several thousand allies stood in grim silence, waiting. "They will attack tomorrow," Leonidas said. "Not because they need to. They could starve us out in a week. But Xerxes cannot allow the world to see Greeks defying him without consequence. His pride will not permit it." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "Tomorrow, we show them what consequence truly means." That evening, Xerxes himself approached the Greek lines, carried on his enormous golden throne by a dozen slaves. He was tall, regal, his beard curled in the Assyrian fashion, his robes worth more than entire Greek cities. He stopped just beyond arrow range and gestured for Leonidas to approach. The Spartan king walked alone across the no-man's land between armies. "You are brave, Spartan," Xerxes called down, his voice resonant with practiced authority. "I admire bravery, even in my enemies. Kneel before me now, and I will make you lord of all Greece. You will command my western armies. Your sons will be princes." Leonidas looked up at the towering throne, at the self-proclaimed god-king perched upon it like an idol awaiting worship. "If you knew anything about Spartans," he replied quietly, "you would know that we are trained from birth to hold our ground. I have kneeled before gods. You are no god. You are a man sitting on a chair too large for him, commanding slaves who fight because they fear the whip. My men fight because they love their homeland." He turned his back on the King of Kings and walked back to his lines. Behind him, Xerxes' face contorted with rage. "I will erase Sparta from history. I will salt the earth where your city stands. I will—" But Leonidas no longer listened. Tomorrow, the words would end. Tomorrow, the killing would begin. The morning mist still clung to the hot springs when the first Persian attack came. Xerxes, in his arrogance, sent the Medes, subject troops from his empire's heartland, capable warriors, but nothing compared to his elite forces. He expected an easy first victory, something to warm the blood of his army and break the spirit of the Greeks. He was catastrophically wrong. The narrow pass reduced warfare to its most brutal essence. There was no room for cavalry charges, no space for the complex maneuvers that had won Persia an empire. There was only the shield wall. The Spartans formed their phalanx with mechanical precision, 8 men deep, their bronze shields overlapping to create an impenetrable barrier, their long spears bristling forward like the quills of some terrible beast. Behind them, the Thespians and other allies held the secondary lines. The Medes charged, and the slaughter began. The first wave crashed against the Spartan shields and simply stopped. The Medes, accustomed to enemies who broke and ran, found themselves pressing against a wall that did not give, would not give, and while they pushed and died against that wall, the Spartan spears did their work. Leonidas fought in the front rank, as tradition demanded. His spear punched through throats, through chests, through the desperate faces of men who had been told this would be easy. When his spear shattered, he drew his sword and kept killing. The blade rose and fell in rhythmic arcs, each stroke economical, precise, deadly. Beside him, Dienekes worked with the calm efficiency of a craftsman. He had perfected the art of killing over 40 years of warfare, and now he demonstrated his mastery. A thrust to the groin, a slash across the eyes, a brutal shield bash that caved in a man's face. He barely seemed to breathe hard. The dead piled up in front of the wall. After 2 hours, Xerxes withdrew the Medes. Their survivors stumbled back across the corpse-strewn ground, their faces blank with shock. They had never seen anything like this. They had never imagined that war could be so efficient. Xerxes watched from his throne, his knuckles white on the armrests. "Send the Scythians," he ordered. "Send the Psyche. Send everyone." Wave after wave came. Different faces, different armor, the same result. The narrow pass negated every Persian advantage. Their numbers meant nothing when only a few dozen men could engage at once. Their archers could not find angles past the cliffs. Their cavalry sat useless in the rear, and the Spartans rotated their lines with clockwork precision. When the front rank tired, they stepped back and let fresh men take their place. The killing never stopped. The wall never broke. By nightfall, Xerxes had lost over 10,000 men. The Greeks had lost fewer than 300, almost all of them allies from the smaller cities. Not a single Spartan had fallen. In the Persian camp, the survivors whispered to each other in horrified tones. The Spartans were not men, they said. They were demons. They were monsters. They were something beyond human comprehension. But they were wrong. The Spartans were entirely human. They were simply humans who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this moment, and they were very, very good at their work. That night, Leonidas walked among his men, clasping forearms, sharing quiet words of praise. They cleaned their weapons and ate their meals and bound their minor wounds. Several laughed and joked, the dark humor of soldiers who had cheated death once more. "How do you feel, my king?" Dieneces asked, wiping Persian blood from his blade. Leonidas considered the question seriously. His arms ached. His back screamed. He had killed more men today than he could count, and tomorrow they would do it all again. "I feel," he said slowly, "like a Spartan." On the second day, Xerxes sent his immortals. They came at noon, when the sun hung directly overhead and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. 10,000 of Persia's finest warriors, the elite guard who had never known defeat, whose golden armor gleamed with the reflection of 100 conquered nations. They marched in perfect formation, their steps synchronized, their faces hidden behind ornate bronze masks that made them look more like statues than men. The Greeks watched them approach without comment. After yesterday's slaughter, there was no need for speeches. "The King of Kings sends us his best," Dieneces observed. "I'm almost flattered." "Don't be," Alpheus muttered. "These ones might actually know how to fight." The immortals reached the wall of corpses from the previous day's battle and, with surprising discipline, clambered over it without breaking formation. They carried short spears and wicker shields reinforced with bronze, and they moved with the fluid confidence of professional killers. Leonidas hefted his shield. Forward. The Spartans advanced to meet them. For the first time, the fighting was even. The immortals were not conscript farmers or second-rate garrison troops. They were warriors bred for war, selected from the finest families of the Persian nobility, and trained from childhood in the arts of combat. Their spears flickered like serpent tongues, probing for gaps in the Spartan defense. But they were not Spartans. The difference revealed itself in subtle ways. Where the immortals fought as individuals, each man seeking personal glory, the Spartans fought as a single organism. Their shields locked together into an impenetrable wall, their spears thrust in coordinated waves, 3 or 4 men striking at the same target simultaneously. When one man stepped back, another seamlessly took his place. And when the Spartans pushed, truly pushed, with the full weight of their phalanx behind them, the immortals discovered that they were not, in fact, immortal at all. The battle raged for hours. The corpses mounted. Blood turned the ground to mud, and slowly, inexorably, the immortals began to break. It started in the rear ranks, where men could see over the shoulders of their comrades to the killing ground ahead. They saw their brothers falling by the dozens. They saw the crimson-cloaked demons who never seemed to tire, never seemed to falter, never seemed to die. And for the first time in their lives, the immortals knew fear. They retreated. Xerxes watched from his throne, and according to the historians who recorded this day, he leaped to his feet 3 times in rage and horror. His finest warriors, his invincible guard, had been thrown back like common fodder. The Greeks let them go. There was no pursuit, no attempt to press the advantage. Leonidas knew that his men needed rest, and he knew that the Persians would come again. They always did. That night, while the Greeks ate and recovered, something changed in the Persian camp. Xerxes summoned his generals, his priests, his advisors. He demanded to know how a handful of Greeks could stand against the greatest army ever assembled. He demanded solutions, and someone, a traitor, a shepherd named Ephialtes, answered, "There is another path, great king. A goat track through the mountains. I can show you." Ephialtes was a Greek, born deformed, rejected by his own people. He had tried to join Leonidas's force days earlier, but his twisted body could not hold a shield properly, and he had been turned away. Now, nursing that humiliation like a bleeding wound, he offered Xerxes what gold and glory could not buy: a way around the hot gates. Xerxes smiled for the first time in 2 days. "Show me this path," he said, "and you shall be rewarded beyond your dreams." At midnight, the immortals, the survivors of the day's battle, reinforced by fresh companies, began their march through the mountains. The trap was closing. The warning came before dawn. A runner, gasping and stumbling, burst through the Greek camp with news that struck like a physical blow. The immortals had found the mountain path. They had overwhelmed the Phocian guards posted there. By sunrise, they would emerge behind the Greek lines, and the pass would become a kill box. Leonidas received the news in silence. The other Greek commanders gathered around him, their faces pale in the torchlight. "We should withdraw immediately," the Theban commander urged. "If we move now, we can escape before the jaws close." "To where?" Leonidas asked quietly. "To what? They will catch us in the open ground. Their cavalry will run us down before we reach the next defensible position. Then we stand here and die for nothing." "No," Leonidas shook his head. "We stand here and die for something, but not all of us." He turned to the assembled commanders, his face carved from the same stone that had built Sparta. "Take your men and go, all of you. Fall back to the isthmus, reinforce the positions there. The fleet still fights at Artemisium. If they can delay the Persian navy, Greece may yet have time to organize. And you, the Spartans, stay." Silence fell over the gathering. The Thespians' commander, a man named Thermopylae, stepped forward. "The Thespians stay as well," he said. "You are not the only men who know how to die on their feet." Leonidas studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your courage does you honor." "Honor?" Thermopylae smiled grimly. "I have a wife and 3 daughters waiting for me in Thespia. If Xerxes is not stopped here, they will be slaves within the month. I do not stay for honor. I stay because there is no other choice I can live with." By the first gray light of dawn, the Greek army had scattered, 4,000 men melting into the mountain paths, racing south to fight another day. Behind them, they left a rearguard of legendary proportions: 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and, forcibly retained, 400 Thebans whose loyalty Leonidas did not entirely trust. Leonidas gathered his men for the final time. "Eat a good breakfast," he told them. "For tonight, we dine in Hades." No one laughed, no one wept. They simply nodded and ate their meal with the calm deliberation of men who understood exactly what the next few hours would bring. Dieneces sat beside his king, chewing dried meat mechanically. "I have a request, my king." "Name it. When we fall, and we will fall, let our bodies bar the path. Let us pile so high that the Persians must climb over us to advance. Let our deaths cost them time. Every hour we buy is an hour for Greece to prepare." Leonidas clasped his friend's forearm. "Your request is granted, and I will pile beside you, old friend. There is no place I would rather be." The sun rose over the mountains, and with it came the distant sound of marching feet. The immortals were descending from the mountain path. The main Persian army was forming up for a final assault, and in the narrow pass called the Hot Gates, 1,400 Greeks prepared to write their names in blood and fire. Leonidas drew his sword and walked to the front of his men. "Today," he called out, "we become legend." They met the Persians in the open ground before the wall. Leonidas had made a calculated decision. The old wall could not protect them against enemies attacking from both directions. But in the open, where space allowed, the Spartans could use their superior skill to maximum effect. They would not defend. They would attack. The Persian front ranks had barely formed when the crimson wave crashed into them. What followed was not a battle. It was a demonstration of what human beings could achieve when every shred of self-preservation had been burned away, when the only goal remaining was to take as many enemies as possible into the darkness. Leonidas carved a path toward Xerxes' command post, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision. Beside him, Dieneces and the twins Alpheus and Maron formed a wedge that drove deep into the Persian formation. They killed with joy, with abandon, with the fierce elation of men who had nothing left to lose. The Persians fell back. They charged again, driven forward by their officers' whips, and the Greeks met them again, and again, and again. Leonidas lost track of time. The world narrowed to the space between heartbeats, the flash of an enemy spear, the thud of a shield, the wet sound of bronze entering flesh. His arms burned with exhaustion, but his body kept moving, kept killing, kept defying the mathematics that should have overwhelmed them hours ago. A Persian arrow took Dieneces through the thigh. The old warrior snapped off the shaft and kept fighting, leaving a trail of blood with every step. "That tickles," he grunted, decapitating an immortal with a single stroke. Alpheus fell, swarmed by a dozen enemies. His twin Maron screamed his brother's name and hurled himself into the mass, killing 4 men before they brought him down beside Alpheus. The brothers died as they had lived, together. Aristodemus took a blow to the head that cracked his helmet and left him blind in one eye. He fought on, his sword never slowing. One by one the Spartans fell, and still the survivors fought. By midday, the ground was carpeted with Persian dead. Xerxes' officers reported that they had lost another 20,000 men, perhaps more. The Greeks, outnumbered 100 to 1, had killed at a ratio that defied all logic, but mathematics eventually prevails. Leonidas's spear shattered. He drew his sword. The sword broke. He drew his dagger. When the dagger was lost, he fought with his hands, with his teeth, with the shattered edge of his shield. A Persian spear found his side. He staggered but did not fall. Another spear took him through the chest. A third pierced his thigh. Still he stood, still he fought, until a final blow from behind brought him to his knees. The last thing Leonidas saw was his men, his brothers, fighting their way toward him. They reached his body and stood over it in a final desperate stand, refusing to let the Persians claim their king. They fought until there was no one left to fight. When the fighting finally ended, silence fell over Thermopylae like a shroud. The pass was choked with dead. Persian bodies lay in drifts, in heaps, in mountains of flesh and iron. Among them, scattered like crimson flowers in a field of death, lay the Spartans. Not a single one had fled. Not a single one had asked for quarter. They had fought until the last man fell, and even then, they had exacted a terrible price. Xerxes descended from his throne and walked among the dead. His golden sandals sank into the blood-soaked earth. His fine robes trailed through the carnage. His face, the face of a man who had proclaimed himself a god, was pale with something that might have been shock or fear or the first stirrings of wisdom. "Find me their king," he ordered. They found Leonidas's body at the center of the Spartan dead. He had fallen on his face, his arms still reaching forward, his hands still clenched as if grasping for one more enemy to drag down with him. Around him lay a ring of his men, their bodies forming a protective wall even in death. Xerxes stared at the fallen king for a long time. "Cut off his head," he finally said. "Mount it on a stake. Let all who see it know the fate of those who defy the King of Kings." His generals exchanged uneasy glances. This was a violation of every custom of war, a desecration that would outrage the Greek world. But they obeyed. They did not know that this act of petty vengeance would haunt Xerxes for the rest of his life. They did not know that this desecration would unite Greece as no living leader ever could. They did not know that Leonidas's death would be worth more than his life. Among the Persian officers that day was a young commander named Mardonius, one of Xerxes' most trusted generals. He surveyed the carnage with professional detachment, calculating the cost of this victory. "We lost 20,000 men, perhaps more," he reported quietly, "against a few hundred Greeks." Xerxes' face contorted. "They are dead. We won. Yes, great king, we won." Mardonius paused. "But Greece has many narrow passes, many walls, many men who will remember what happened here. They will remember that we crushed their defenders like insects. They will remember that 300 men held 200,000 for 3 days. They will remember that free men died on their feet rather than live on their knees. They will remember, great king, and they will take courage from it." Xerxes dismissed his general with an angry wave, but as he marched south toward Athens, toward the burned Acropolis and the empty streets, toward the naval disaster at Salamis that would shatter his fleet, He would think often of that blood-soaked pass and the men who had chosen death over submission, and he would never truly understand them. That was his tragedy. He could conquer nations, but he could not comprehend why some men valued freedom more than life. He could command millions, but he could not grasp the simple truth that had driven Leonidas to his doom. Some things are worth dying for. Aristodemos lived. An eye infection had forced him from the line on the final day, and Leonidas, recognizing that a blind man was more liability than asset, had ordered him to withdraw with the other wounded. He had obeyed, though every step away from his brothers had felt like a knife in his heart. When news of the defeat reached Sparta, Aristodemos went with it. The city received him with silence, not with anger, not with open condemnation, but with something worse. A cold, total silence that made clear exactly what they thought of a Spartan who had returned from a battle that had killed his king. They called him the Trembler. They refused to share fire with him, to trade with him, to speak his name. His wife looked at him with eyes that contained not love but shame. His son avoided him in the streets. The other survivor was a man named Pantites, who had been sent as a messenger to Thessaly before the final battle. When he returned to Sparta and learned what had happened, the shame was so great that he hanged himself. Aristodemos chose a different path. He trained, he practiced. He pushed his aging body to its limits and beyond. For 1 year, he lived as a ghost in his own city, enduring the whispers and the sidelong glances and the crushing weight of his survival. And when the Greeks finally faced the Persians again at Plataea, Aristodemos was there. He fought that day like a man possessed, hurling himself into the thickest fighting with no regard for his own life. He killed and killed, seeking the redemption that could only come from a glorious death. He found it. The Spartans who witnessed his final stand reported that Aristodemos died laughing, his sword buried in a Persian officer, his body pierced by a dozen wounds. He had proven, at last, that he was no trembler. He had washed away his shame in blood. But the city of Sparta, with its unyielding code, still did not honor him. He had broken formation, they said. He had sought personal glory rather than fighting as part of the unit. His courage was undeniable, but his discipline was lacking. It was a harsh judgment, perhaps an unjust one, but it was the Spartan way. The rest of Greece, however, remembered Thermopylae differently. In Athens and Corinth, in Argos and Thebes, poets sang of the 300 who had held the pass. Monuments rose, legends grew. The epitaph that was carved at the hot gates became the most famous tribute in military history. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. It was a simple message, devoid of boasts or glory or claims of heroism. Just a statement of fact. We were ordered to hold this pass. We held it. We died. That is all. And somehow, that simplicity was more powerful than any epic poem. 1 year later, at Plataea, Greece destroyed the Persian army. The great host that had drunk rivers dry was shattered on a single afternoon. Mardonius, the general who had warned Xerxes about the cost of Thermopylae, died with a Spartan spear through his chest. The Persian dream of Western conquest ended in the same blood-soaked dust where it had begun. Xerxes fled back to Persia, his ambitions broken, his legend diminished. He would spend the remaining 14 years of his life in increasingly paranoid isolation, building monuments to his own greatness that no one believed. When he was finally assassinated by his own bodyguard, few mourned him. But Leonidas endured. The Spartans recovered his body, or what remained of it, and brought it home with the honors due a king. Gorgo, his queen, stood stone-faced as the procession passed, showing the world the face of Spartan womanhood. Only later, in the privacy of her chambers, did she allow herself to weep. Their son Pleistarchus grew to manhood and took his father's throne. He ruled wisely, though he never achieved his father's glory. But then, few men ever could. The story of the 300 spread across the Greek world and beyond. It crossed the Mediterranean to Rome, where it inspired republican virtues and martial discipline. It crossed the centuries to medieval Europe, where knights invoked it before desperate battles. It crossed the oceans to the New World, where free men founding new nations looked to it for guidance. And it endures still, not because Leonidas won. He did not. Not because the 300 were superhuman. They were merely very well trained. It endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the belief that there are things worth dying for, that courage and discipline can face down seemingly impossible odds, that free men, fighting for their homes and families, are capable of miracles. Xerxes commanded an empire. Leonidas commanded 300 men. 2,500 years later, every schoolchild knows the name Leonidas. Xerxes is a footnote. Come and take them. Those three words echo still, across the centuries, a challenge from the dead to the living, a reminder that tyrants, no matter how powerful, will eventually face men who cannot be bought, cannot be broken, cannot be made to kneel. The hot gates are quiet now. The hot springs still bubble up from the earth, filling the air with sulfur. The pass has widened over the millennia as the sea receded, and modern highways carry tourists to a modest monument where the Spartans made their stand. But if you stand there at dawn, when the mist rises from the springs and the world is still, you can almost hear them. The tramp of bronze-shod feet, the clash of shields locking together, the war cry of men who knew they were about to die and charged forward anyway. Mullen Lub, come and take them.